because we're going to be talking about some spiritual troublemakers today, we decided that we're going to shake things up. So Sydney, Tina, and Tim are going to do a trinity of spiritual reflections on the Transcendentalists in a Unitarian sanctuary. So, they didn't tell you, the ushers did not tell you when you walked in, or when you appeared on your couch, that we're going to begin with a pop quiz. How many of us would describe ourselves as more spiritual than religious? Show of hands. Okay, more spiritual than religious. Okay, how many of us would say that we are enlivened and revived by being out in nature? Show of hands. And I see all of you on the virtual campus as well. I can see your hands. How many of you would say that nature is a spiritual practice, being within nature? Okay. How about this one? Humans are essentially good but get corrupted by greed and ignorance. How many would say that? Okay. No question about that one. How about you believe the key to spiritual growth is asking questions, education, and learning? Show us that. Okay, very good. How about this one? No gender is intellectually superior to another. Okay, yeah. Okay, ooh, yes. This question, your personal experience is more important than someone else's so-called logic. Okay? Said with love and respect, Christianity is but one expression of faith, and that truth, wisdom, and other perspectives are found in other world religions. How many of us? Okay. What about this one? Nonviolent civil disobedience, nonviolent, against government and unjust laws is valid. Okay. Very good. So, if you raised your hand once or every time, you have the ability to thank right now the Transcendentalists. Because the Transcendentalists, each and every one of those, is a contribution from one of the most extraordinary collections of minds that have ever lived in the history of this country at the same time. So we're going to take us back to the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Unitarianism, although wonderfully progressive for its time, was still a biblically based faith tradition. They believed Jesus was a human being, but as a human being, the Unitarians relied solely on Christian scripture when they did their lessons and sermons. Jesus was the main focus within Unitarian congregations in this country. And then something happened. The Transcendentalists came along, and that's when the slide can appear, and brought within this very staid and proper Unitarianism a spiritual TNT, a spiritual dynamite that just blasted Unitarianism and religion as we knew it at the time and still know it in ways that have made us who we are today. So just a few of these folks: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Emily Dickinson, Henry David Thoreau, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lydia Maria Child, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, William Wordsworth, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Bronson Alcott, and Walt Whitman. This collection of extraordinary religious and intellectual thinkers put forth that you no longer needed the Bible, you no longer needed stories about Jesus, you no longer needed even, and I always tremble when I say this, you no longer needed a church building or a congregation, that you as an individual can have a direct experience and ability to perceive the divine through your own individual experience. They said that spirituality comes from the self and through the self, and not specifically through any one religion. They said that your personal insight and your experience is more critical, as it has more value than someone else's supposed reasoning or logic. What they said is you can go out into the natural world, you can perceive with your own senses just the wonder of being alive. They taught a sort of natural mysticism. They said, just look at a sunrise, look at a tree. I'm looking right out the window here at a beautiful blooming tree right along Alluvial Ave, and they said, you can see the miracle of life right there within the dawning day, within the budding tree, within the beauty of a Fresno, well, they didn't say Fresno, but a Fresno sunset. They would have if they were here looking at our sunsets. They elevated each human being to be able to perceive the divine. They didn't debase them by calling them sinners or saying that they were in need of salvation. The next thing that these radical thinkers did is they said, we love the Christian story, we love Jesus, but there's more to it than that. They are the first group that collectively began to study world religions. So they looked at the text of Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Taoism, and it opened Unitarianism to not just a Christian perspective, but various ways of looking at the mysteries of life and death and various truths. I'm just going to quote Henry David Thoreau when he was hanging out near Walden Pond. He wrote, "In the morning, I bathe my intellect in the stupendous philosophy of Hinduism's Bhagavad Gita, since whose composition years of the gods have elapsed." Now listen to this. "And in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial. And I doubt if that philosophy is not to be referred to a previous state of existence so remote in its sublimity from our conceptions, I lay down the book and go to my well for water, and lo, the pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges." Theodore Parker, a great Unitarian, called Christianity one suit of clothes that you could put on a deeper and more eternal truth. And each world religion was just another set of clothes that went around something that at its core truly has no definition. They also taught that we are interconnected, that there is an energy and a consciousness that links all human life, but they would say beyond human life, all things, nature, rocks, grass, trees. In fact, famously, Thoreau wrote, "I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate within me, through me." The currents of a universal being, a oneness. The Transcendentalists also believed out of this oneness comes a responsibility for social reform and social justice. And so we had Transcendentalists who were leaders in the movement to abolish slavery, including Theodore Parker and Margaret Fuller. The Transcendentalists gave birth to what we now call feminism, teaching an equality of genders intellectually, which was unheard of for the most part at this time. Margaret Fuller, the great Transcendentalist, published the first feminist book in America called Women in the 19th Century. She wrote that in 1845. Thank you, Margaret Fuller. The Transcendentalists were leaders in the movement to give women the vote. They were pioneers in education, bringing over the concept of kindergarten from Germany. They were leaders in prison reform and compassionate care for the mentally ill. And the idea of nonviolent action to protest government came from Walden Pond and Ralph Waldo Emerson. he is the first person who, Henry David Thoreau, sorry, he's the first person to use the language of nonviolent civil protest. His idea and the idea of the Transcendentalists journeyed to India and informed Gandhi, and then through Gandhi, those ideas came back and informed Martin Luther King, but they were Transcendentalist ideas. In closing, they were considered radicals. It created a almost religious revolution in the Boston area. Transcendentalists were being thrown out of churches. It almost threatened to split Unitarianism into two different denominations. Luckily, we realized that we can have broad enough boundaries to hold those who wanted to hold on to the Jesus Christian story only, as well as these ideas of Transcendentalism. We are going to hear how these ideas have impacted two very different spiritual journeys. We're going to hear from Sydney through the lens of anthropology. We're going to hear from Tina through the lens of philosophy, how their lives, their spiritual lives, and their religious lives as Unitarian Universalists have been forever altered because of these radical ideas that today don't seem radical at all. It just seems like, isn't that what Unitarian Universalism is? And so to get us ready to hear more wisdom from Sydney and then Tina, we're going to rise, embody your spirit, and sing a wonderful transcendentalist hymn. You're going to recognize the melody. I hope you enjoy these very transcendentalist words.
When I chose to attend the Unitarian Church of Fresno, as it was known in those days, in 1967, I made the decision for three reasons, two of which are relevant here. As an anthropologist, I know that there are many religions in the world and that none can lay claim to absolute truth. So I require a religious system that is broadly cross-cultural. Then, it is essential that the religion be compatible with science, specifically evolution theory and anti-racism. What I did not know then, and did not discover until many years later, was that these two features actually had their roots not in Unitarianism itself, but in the Transcendentalist rebellion, which Reverend Tim has already described. Unitarians, pre-Transcendentalist, were actually quite biblical, though not literally interpreting. The change had two different implications. First, the concept of religion, of what a religion is, expanded to at least Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. Second, by including immersion in and contemplation of the environment as an individual religious expression, they opened the door for acceptance of time depth beyond the 4,000 years allowed by the Bible, and for the recognition of mechanistic change, which is the cornerstone of Darwinian evolution. One famous transcendentalist, Margaret Fuller, notice that women were included in transcendentalism very importantly. One famous transcendentalist, Margaret Fuller, visited the Native American tribes in Wisconsin and Minnesota, where she stayed with and talked to the Menominee and the Winnebago. Although she apparently did not see any religious observance, it would have been the medicine rite. She writes without condescension that she found them a warm, welcoming, hospitable people. I have a hunch that she would have acknowledged their religion, their beliefs as a religion, and would have been impressed by the month-long medicine rite. I like to imagine that Margaret Fuller's love of language would have led her to a fascination with the 65-part Navajo verb, parentheses, the most complex verb in English has 8 parts, parentheses closed. Another famous transcendentalist, Ralph Waldo Emerson, joined her in admiring the intimate mutual relationship of the Native Americans to the environment and in deploring their cruel treatment by the United States government. Emerson might well have enjoyed exploring the concept of Alchuringa, central to the religion of the desert peoples of Australia. Alchuringa is the timeless dream time when the sacred animals walked the earth, constructing its features, as they still do in a dimension not our own. Thoreau might have felt kinship with these same people because they loved their desert environment, which to outsiders seems like a barren lunar landscape. They loved it as intensely and with the same spirituality as he loved the lush greenery of Walden Pond. The Transcendentalists might all have been aesthetically pleased by the balance between randomness, mutation, and patternness, natural selection, which is the essence of modern evolution theory. I think, had there been an American anthropology at that time, the Transcendentalists would have embraced its ideas of the psychic unity of humankind and the universality of religion. While I can't claim that they were broadly cross-cultural or evolutionary, they constructed the fertile soil in which these ideas could flourish. So, I think of myself as a Unitarian Transcendentalist, and perhaps you will consider incorporating their ideas into your spiritual journey.
Good morning again. Historically, I was not a fan of organized religion. Raised by two ex-Catholics, I was taught that organized religion was full of hypocrisy, and that every organized religion was the same, with different words and different gods. My parents taught me that religion was for fools and simpletons, the opiate of the masses. As Nietzsche said, there was no God, no such thing as divinity. None of that ever felt right to me. I always had a sense of a divine presence, even if I could not explain it. The views of my peers seemed to reinforce the story that there was no God, no such thing as divine. A full-blown Generation Xer here. My teenage life and early adulthood were both like a Richard Linklater film, #slacker. Oh dear. I moved from apathetic group to apathetic group, with each group having in common a profound sense of alienation from everyday American life. Late 1970s punk rockers like the Sex Pistols screamed out, "No future," and I felt understood. About 10 years later, Bono moaned and cried out to the world, "I still haven't found what I'm looking for." And I thought I couldn't have said it better myself. When Kurt Cobain died, I had a wake-up call. If I don't find some kind of answers to this spiritual yearning that I felt within, I might actually die. Thus began my spiritual quest. It started with studying philosophy. That's Socrates. For a while, I thought reason and rational thinking would help me find what I was looking for. But I soon realized that philosophy could not answer my spiritual questions. I knew I could not answer my spiritual questions. Slide? Oh, okay. There's a slide missing. Anyway, I knew I had to look elsewhere for those. I began studying Buddhism and meditated every week with a Tibetan monk. A few years later, I joined 2 different Quaker churches. What both Buddhism and Quakers had in common was a focus on meditation. During this time of my life, I also joined my husband on long walks in the woods, a favorite pastime of ours. I found that these walks provided their own sense of meditative bliss. Slide. Soon after this period, I met a lovely older woman named Hetty. Hetty was a theosophist, a religion that began in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution with the central tenet of the oneness of all things. Hetty introduced me to the 19th century Transcendentalists, cousins of the Theosophists. While studying Transcendentalism, I discovered that it had 2 key predecessors in thought: Unitarianism and Enlightenment German philosophy. The Unitarian influence on Transcendentalism is well known, and we've discussed it today. To briefly recap, the 19th century Unitarians rejected the Trinity and the divinity of Christ in favor of a belief that God exists in the form of one unified being. Unitarians also believed in the power of reason as the foundation of spiritual life. The Transcendentalists developed their ideas in reaction to Unitarianism, focusing less on defining God as unitary, however, and more on the importance of the individual human person, focusing less on reason and more on sensory experiences and emotion as the path to the divine. The influence on Transcendentalism of the philosophy of the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant is less well known. Kant is known for his transcendental idealism, according to which the human experience of things is in the form of what he called appearances, which is just another way of saying that human experience is mind-dependent. Kant argued that because the way humans experience things is a combination of sensory data and cognitive processing, human beings cannot experience God, who is fully transcendent, or beyond both sensory data and our ability to process it. But in his later work, Kant added an important qualification to his original view that God is unknowable. We may not be able to know God, but if there is such a thing as morality, then its source is in the transcendent, or the ideal. To be moral for Kant is to use our free will, to choose right over wrong, to aim in all we do to conform our actions to the transcendent, or the ideal. The Transcendentalists of the 19th century adopted Kant's idea that morality is about free will and the pursuit of the ideal, and developed it into 4 key values. Access to God should be direct, as Reverend Tim mentioned to you earlier today, not just that it should be, that it is. Beauty, in the form of artwork of any kind, inspires us to the divine. Third, nature, as Reverend Tim said, is central to spiritual life. And 4, the compatibility between individualism, which is a value, and equality for all, which the Transcendentalists thought was a companion value. In my own spiritual life, I engage all 4 of these values. I meditate regularly to experience direct access to God. I surround myself with beautiful things, works of art, whether it's music, artwork, interior decorating. I take long walks in nature and regularly visit the ocean, my favorite place, actually, where I gain perspective and insight. And finally, I nurture a belief that each human being is an individual person with unique talents, gifts, thoughts, and needs, and that together, all humans should create what Kant called a kingdom of ends, or a world in which every human being is treated as an end in themselves and never as a means. It is in these ways that my own spiritual practice is decidedly transcendentalist, or at least, as the kids say, transcendentalist adjacent. I love the fact that the Unitarian Universalist Church embraces this and all other aspects of my own personal spiritual journey. I have found an organized religion that works for me, despite the early message that I received that such a thing was impossible to find in the world.